SCRUM Artifacts. So what you see here is a typical life cycle of Scrum. So the product owner comes up with the product backlog and they continue grooming it throughout the process. Then there's the sprint planning, which leads to the sprint backlog. And during this sprint execution, the team produces output, which is a potentially increment of the shippable product, and which is demoed during the sprint review. And then comes the sprint retrospective, where the team reviews how it went, what went right, what went wrong in terms of the stories, in terms of the process, and that goes back to the next cycle and so on. So during this process, what are the artifacts that are generated or used? So one of the highest level would be the product portfolio backlog. So if you're thinking in terms of, for example, Microsoft Office, the whole suite is a portfolio backlog, while the product backlog would be the feature list for, let's say, example, Word as a software. And once the team picks up prioritized features, they create the sprint backlog. Now, the tools that are also used during this process in sizing the stories, in sizing, estimating, there are several, but one of the key ones that are commonly used is poker planning. There are cards that are used, and of course the user stories are one of the key artifacts that are defining the feature or how the user is going to use certain feature. And there is the Scrum task board, which basically contains the sprint backlog and shows in a visual manner where each of them are, each of the tasks, the progress. There's the burn down charts for at all levels. You have burn down chart for portfolio level, on the product level, as well as the sprint level, and it basically shows how the progress is against the original plan. Then comes the product increment, of course, and finally the retrospective output. So generally this is a document, a list of suggestions, features, or other process improvements that were identified, and goes back to the process to ensure the future sprints are more productive and produces better value for everyone. Let's go to the details on each of this. So product backlog, what is that? It's a prioritized list of desired product functionality. It provides a centralized and shared understanding of what to build and the order in which to build them. It's a highly visible artifact at the heart of the Scrum framework. This is accessible to all project participants. In fact, I say if you want to see and identify how Scrum process is going, you just need to review the backlog and how well groomed it is. That will show, that's like a first indicator if the team is doing a good job. Now let's go into looking at the three kinds of backlog and generally what kind of unit of measurement is used and when is it done. So the first one is the portfolio backlog. Like I was explaining as an example, the Microsoft Office suite is if you look at the whole thing, it's a portfolio backlog, which would include products like Office Word, Office Excel, Office PowerPoint, etc. So the items in this is the portfolio backlog. The size that are used, or sizing methods, estimation method used, is called t-shirt sizing. So generally like extra small, small, medium, large, extra large, etc. And this is done during the portfolio planning. Now, once you pick up one of the product and break it down by features, you have the product backlog. And these are generally measured in the unit of story points. And this is done during the product backlog grooming process. And during the performance of the sprint, or rather before the performance of sprint, the prioritized item pulled for the sprint creates the sprint backlog. And during the sprint planning 2, these are broken down into tasks. The unit of measurement is hours, and this is done during the sprint planning 1 and sprint planning 2. Now let's look into what are the contents, or what generally constitutes the product backlog. What are the items? So there are of course the features. There are also the defects or bugs that are sent back, and there could be other works like research, technical work. There could be also knowledge acquisition related work. So product backlog is created, it's refined. We'll go into the process of refining how it's broken down in the future slides. And then we have the estimation process, like using poker planning, and then the process of identifying which one to do first and which one to do subsequently according to the value to the user. So user stories, like I was explaining, comes in different sizes. So if you define it in a very large, more like a release kind of a thing, like a month size work, it's called epic. When it's broken down, it's called coarse grain, which are generally bigger than a sprint, but in like probably might be a week or half a week kind of measurement. And then they are broken down further to fine grain. So these are basically stories that can be pulled for the sprint. Usually it takes days to do, and then these are broken down during the sprint planning into tasks, and the tasks are usually measured in hours and are done. These are ready for execution by the team during the sprint execution. So this one is just a typical example of a poker planning card. As you can see, most of the numbering there is using the Fibonacci series. So most of the time you don't really go about using this the whole set of cards. Generally you use 1, 2, 3 up to probably 20 and no further. So generally most of the time that's what it's limited to. The others are just kept as too large or undefined. We'll go into the details of how to go about doing poker planning in another session. Let's look at one of the example of a Scrum board on the wall. So as you can see on the leftmost side, that's all the stories from the backlog, generally written in a post-it and listed down on the wall. Then the next ones you see are the stories that were pulled for the sprint, and they are further broken down into setup task, and you can see they are being worked on, and finally once it's done, it's moved to the furthest corner. Now this can be, though it might look a little bit chaotic, usually we get reaction like, whoa, that's how you maintain your stories or something like that. But it has a lot of benefit of its own to have it in that post-it. And there's a fact factor of experience when you move one story from one lane to the next. It gives sense of satisfaction also. It has proven over the years to be a very effective tool. However, the team might not always be in the same room, as the case nowadays with teams distributed across the world. Or sometimes it's just for convenience, like someone wants to work from home, not the whole team comes to the same room every day. So in that case, there are other tools available. This is just an example of something we use. Digital scrum boards. There are several different digital scrum boards available online, and this is just an example which is basically showing the stories and the lanes, and they're generally, once you move from one lane to the other, it updates the status and everyone can see where each of the tasks are, and each of the tasks can also have other details that can be attached inside, since it's a software. One of the key radiators of the progress of how the work is happening against the plan is a burn down chart. So what you can see in front, there are three types of burn down charts. So there's the sprint burn down chart, which basically shows the progress of the sprint, the release burn down chart, which progresses how the product, the release is coming along, and the entire product's burn down chart. You can also have a portfolio burn down chart if needed. Now, if you look at the diagram, there's the x-axis and there's the y-axis. Now, the x-axis is basically representing the time. So let's say if you are running a 2-week sprint, so those are the 10 working days that's represented on the x-axis, while the story points are represented on the y-axis. So when you start the project, or when you start the sprint rather, you have a certain estimated story point that needs to be delivered by the end of the sprint. So you start at the peak of it, and as the sprint progresses, you bring it down to zero remaining sprints or zero remaining story points. Now, the ideal curve, ideal representation of this is shown through a straight line, but in reality it's rarely that way. So the reality is, maybe in the beginning you might have a little bit of a slow pace, or you might have, so if you have a slow pace, you see the line actually goes above the ideal line, but sometime you might make a faster progress than it was planned, and then the line might drop below the ideal line. So in the beginning, when you are making good progress, probably it's not a good time to add new stories. But let's say like in this specific example, towards the lower part, it seems like the team has been able to burn down most of the points a little, like a couple days ahead of the sprint, of the end of the sprint. So these are the times you can have some of the tasks at the back burner that can be pulled in and completed, so that way to basically have a better velocity for each of the sprint. Now, talking of velocity, what is that? How do you measure velocity? So obviously the burn down for the first sprint is not going to be the same as probably the sprints moving forward. However, it has been seen that after a certain number of sprint, usually 3, the team reaches optimal velocity and kind of continues on with that sprint after sprint thereon, sort of like how it's shown in trend 2. So it's like, there was a little higher, then there was a little lower, and then finally it kind of tapers off to a certain velocity against the time moving forward. So generally there would be a certain gain from the first sprint to the subsequent one, but finally at a time the team will reach a steady state, and that's basically the velocity for the project. And if you don't change any major factor in it, that velocity can be used to as a tool to compute the likely timeline when all the identified features or the release can be done. Now talking about done, it's important to establish a checklist which defines what is going to be considered as a done state for each task. So for example, this is a definition of done example showing, okay, the design has been reviewed, there's a related to code, that coding is completed, etc. Then end user documentation is updated, different level of testing has been done, and well, zero known defect. Of course you can never have a zero defect, but at least enough effort has been done and all known issues and bugs have been resolved. And perhaps some can have a acceptance testing as well as put it into a live server. So all of these steps, it might be all of them, or in your case there might be few less, whichever is the case, that has to be agreed between the product owner and the team, and the progress or the burn down is actually represented through that. So there are different school of thoughts on how to measure burn down, but most of the time the best way to go about is the whole thing or nothing. So if you have a story which is like 3 points and it's like end of the sprint, you are not done with the whole thing even though you have put in enough hours, the best way to go about it is to consider it 0, and once you finish it on the next sprint, that can be counted as a complete 3. So even though the first sprint in which some part of work was done but was not measured, the subsequent sprint will catch up on it, and on the average that would give a better computation of velocity and more predictable results. This slide shows one of the reference materials and some of the images that we sourced from Google Image. Thank you very much.